Thank you. And I want to thank Derek and the staff, especially this gentleman here, who makes sure that everything is audible, which is great. But the first thing I want to do is to thank Jane Blattis. Why? There was an ad which appeared in this morning's Wall Street Journal, Jane. In the Wall Street Journal, a collection of signed and inscribed books and memorabilia by Winston Churchill. And I immediately turned to Derek and said, well, how about it? And he said, well, I could always take it to the Fromm board. I said, oh, no. Let me mention it to the class, because I know we can do a collection. This modest gift of all of this inscribed and signed Churchill material is only $875,000. Anybody want to? Okay. But Jane, I'm not throwing this away. I'm going to put it in my folder. When I go home, I shall review it. And I want you to thank David, and I want to thank you for offering this splendid gift. Anyway, okay. I will say a few words at the end of the class, but let me begin. I really thought about what I wanted to do. One of the things I have here in my collection with me is this, and I'm holding it up. I had them blow it up so you could see it. I have the magazine here. It is the half-century supplement put out by Time magazine in 1950. And you may recall that Time has always had a person of the year or a whatever. Well, this is the man of the half century in 1950, Winston Churchill. And you should know that when Time in 1999 accepted nominations for Person of the Century, Winston Churchill was right there. In fact, the major nomination was written by Benjamin Netanyahu, who used the explanation that Churchill epitomized the struggle for freedom. In the end, Time magazine chose Albert Einstein. Just want you to know that. Although, anybody remember who the couple of the century was? Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, which I mentioned in my course on F.D.R, but okay. In his biography, and I had them, there's a little box that says, I made very little progress. What a strange thing for Churchill to say. But Churchill described the childhood of his great ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, with these words. It is said that famous men are usually the product of unhappy childhoods. The stern compression of circumstance, the twinges of adversity, the spur of slights, the taunts in the early years are needed to evoke that ruthless, feisty purpose and tenacious wit without which great actions are seldom accomplished. I wanted to encapsulate Churchill's growing up to understand, as we said at the very first lecture, that he did not have an ideal childhood, not by any stretch of the imagination. He had to overcome so much to achieve what he did. And this is what Time magazine observed in that essay. I have to get the light right here. Modern psychologists and pedagogues would call Winston Churchill's childhood far from ideal. His early picture of his mother in a riding habit fitting like a skin and off beautifully spotted with mud. She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. Even more remote was his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, brilliant and erratic Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1886, who died when Winston was 20. Lord Randolph thought that Winston was not bright enough to study law. One day, after watching the boy play with his host of 1,500 toy soldiers, Lord Randolph decided Winston's career should be in the army. Do you remember we described that at the very beginning? For Churchill, this growth and development, his determination to be something that he wanted to be, the desire to overcome. And I want to relate this to you all very personally, because each one of you in your life has had to overcome something that you thought was impossible. And yet with tenacity and determination, you did overcome. In the profession of politics, which is what Winston Churchill chose, the voluminous record of Winston Churchill's speeches from 1897 until 1963 is unsurpassed by that of any statesman in history. Indeed, few, if any, writers could match his productivity as a historian, not to mention his contributions as a journalist. The titanic output of his work is staggering. You remember I described to you how he dictated his books. He dictated them while sitting in a bathtub with a little brandy and a cigar. But he did it with a fluency of language. And I want to emphasize and underline that Churchill's ability to communicate, both in the verbal and written form, is what made him the genius that he was. Can you imagine if he had not overcome his stutter, what the world would have been denied? Somebody asked me, by the way, one of the ladies here in class, who had not yet heard Edward R. Murrow's recording of the great speeches of Winston Churchill. I want to remind you, it's in your class file, so you can listen to it, and it's worth listening to it again, just to understand that. Among writers in the English language, perhaps only Shakespeare is more quotable. Isn't that an astounding statement? But it's true. The actions of political conduct, as Churchill framed them, have defined who we are. Remember terms that he used, like Iron Curtain, riddle wrapped in enigma. I mean, how people come up with these statements is really quite remarkable. It is important to note that Churchill framed the historical judgments he rendered and its insight into human terms, and he deserves full credit for it. So what I decided to do in this last class is divide it into two parts. I am going to share with you what I think are some of his best lines, and then I'm going to throw it open to you so that you can ask me questions about Churchill, and some ask, can you ask me other questions? Of course you can. And I'm going to call on Lily later on, who has a story she wants to tell from the Russian perspective. And so we'll do all of that. He wants to find Anne, the Queen of England. He moved on broad, homely lines. She was not very wise nor clever, but she was very like England. What an interesting summary of the country in which you live. It's astounding, really. One wonders, in light of the events of today in New York, how people will look back on the United States and how we will be defined in rhetoric in the future. One of his major opponents was Clement Attlee, who you will recall defeated him, that is to say, the Labour Party defeated the Conservative Party in 1945. He once described Prime Minister Attlee this way: he is a modest man with much to be modest about. I mean, did you have any problem grasping the meaning? Of course not. And it was done in a single sentence. It reminds me, I have to tell you, of an old professor of mine who said that anything you can say in an hour, you can say in 10 minutes. So when I do my podcast every day, this is the commercial, Around the Political World with John Rothmann, I keep it to 10 minutes. I could spend an hour, but I don't. Stanley Baldwin, another prime minister, Conservative Party. Churchill described him this way. Occasionally, he stumbled over the truth, but hastily picked himself up as if nothing had happened. It reminds me of that old object that a clock is right at least twice a day. I thought of that with daylight savings time, I must add. Lord Beaverbrook, who was the press magnate and wartime cabinet minister, how do you describe somebody? And I thought about this really as a definition. And I thought if I were Donald Trump and I were truly witty and I were going to describe Michael Cohen, this is how I'd do it. He is a foul weather friend. Now, I want you to think for a moment when you speak. Do other images or thoughts come to your mind which you don't use as a vehicle for expression? I have to tell you, as somebody who's made a living, and I have made a living all these years by use of my tongue, I have to make sure that I'm always mindful that you can say something, but maybe you can say it better. You all remember Mr. Bevan, a Labourite politician. He was the flamboyant Welsh left-winger who was Churchill's most vicious adversary. He is a merchant of discourtesy. Do you understand? In a single line, he was able to deflate his major opponent. You know, I think of my years in speech training. There are very few people I've encountered who had that wit and ability and who did it spontaneously. Joseph Chamberlain, the great British statesman, yes, related to Neville Chamberlain. He was the uncle of Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain was, at the turn of the century, a high tariff imperialist. And this is what Churchill said of him. Joe Chamberlain loves the working man. He loves to see him work. Now, you're chuckling at this. I want you to imagine having lived with Winston Churchill in Parliament for 60 years and knowing that whatever you said could be thrown right back at you. He described Neville Chamberlain, and I made it a point last week to read you the eulogy. Chamberlain, you'll recall, negotiated the infamous Munich Agreement. And this is what Churchill said, and it's brilliant. He has a lust for peace. And remember how I described that Chamberlain's first cousin, his best friend, was killed in the war? A lust for peace. It is a fantastic way of doing it briefly. Sir Stratford Cripps, the Labourite Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was a socialist. He was a Calvinist with a strict vegetarian and teetotaling habits. He has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I admire. So I want you to think for a minute, if you were to encapsulate your view of your best friend, and I told you to do it in 10 words, Let me tell you, if this were a classroom where you had to write an assignment, that would have been my assignment for all of you. He also said about Cripps, "There, but for the grace of God, goes God." His chest is a cage in which two squirrels are at war, his conscience and his career. Isn't that an interesting, and you know what's great? And this is so important. You can picture it, can't you? In your mind's eye, you can see it. So what about Charles de Gaulle? We have all our crosses to bear. Mine is the cross of Lorraine, which is where de Gaulle was from. It's not an impolite description, but it describes de Gaulle beautifully. He looks like a female llama who has just been surprised in her bath. What were these things? I wish that Churchill were alive. I wish that I could ask him how he did this. But his description of John Foster Dulles, the line I gave you the first day in class, "He is the only bull I know who carries his china closet with him." And again, do you understand? You can picture it, can't you? You can see in your mind's eye. He described Farouk, the king of Egypt. Many of you recall, who was young, dashing. They equated him with the Prince of Wales, Edward VIII. And of course, he turned into a grotesque figure. And this is how Churchill described him. King Farouk was wallowing like a sow in a trough of, well, you think of it, it'll come to you. Of Sir Cedric Hardwicke, the British actor, he said, "You're my fifth favorite actor. The first four are the Marx Brothers." Isn't that amazing? Heaven forbid we should describe our professors that way. He described Adolf Hitler this way: "Into that void strode a maniac, a ferocious genius of the most virulent hatred that has ever overrode the human breast. Corporal Hitler." This wicked man, this repository and embodiment of many forms of soul-destroying hatred, this monstrous product of former wrongs and shames. What a brilliant description. And again, something you could see in your mind. You know, the trick to being a great orator is to be able to let people picture something. Harry Hopkins, F.D.R's aide and troubleshooter, who in the darkest days of the war came to Britain, and remember, he recited to Churchill from the Book of Ruth, "Whither thou goest, I will go. Your God is my God, your people my people." Churchill wept when Churchill, in a lighter moment, wanted to give him some descriptive term. He said, "I dub you Lord Root of the matter," because he always got to the bottom line. Oh, wait, he did have commentary on American political and military leaders. How about Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general? Jackson came of Ulster stock and settled in Virginia. His character was stern, his manner reserved and usually forbidding, his temper Calvinistic, his mode of life strict, frugal, austere. He might have stepped into American history from the command of one of Cromwell's regiments. Okay, this is more esoteric, a little longer. But if this were a course on British history, and I taught you about Cromwell, you would understand this was not a compliment, but it was an apt description. Now, my favorite king of England was naturally John. Magna Carta, John, you know. They gave a Magna Carta despite John. But Churchill described King John, the only King John. He was such a disaster, nobody else was named John. When the long tally is added, it will be seen that the British nation and the English-speaking world owe far more to the vices of John than to the labors of various sovereigns. For it was through the actions of many forces against him that the most famous milestone, the Magna Carta of our rights and freedom, was set up. In other words, Churchill chose to describe, out of great adversity, a great triumph. By the way, do you all remember when they put the plaque up at the site of the Magna Carta, who it was dedicated to? John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He described Lawrence of Arabia. You have to go see the movie again, right? Remember, it's the only movie made in Hollywood that had no women in it. It's all men. But Lawrence of Arabia became, as I mentioned to you when we discussed Churchill's support of Zionism, one of the great friends of Churchill. A man of solitary, austere, to whom existence is not more than a duty, yet a duty to be faithfully discharged. He was indeed a dweller upon the mountaintops where the air is crisp and rarefied, and where the view commands all of the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. He was not in complete harmony with the normal. Isn't that interesting? When you describe greatness and you say, but he was not in complete harmony with the normal. And what do we look for in life? We want people who are normal, right? And yet we know that exceptional people are hardly normal. Whether it's a Winston Churchill or any political leader you can think of. And I would include in that Donald Trump. A normal, or a Barack Obama. You know, it's an interesting concept. Churchill described another contemporary, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who created an empire. This is for you, Livia. Lenin was sent into Russia by the Germans in the same way you might send a file containing a culture of typhoid or cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city, and it worked with amazing accuracy. I mean, what a vivid, marvelous use of language. I mean, I could go on and on. Ramsay MacDonald, the Labourite Prime Minister of Great Britain. He is a sheep in sheep's clothing. Wait, Lilia, this is for you. This is Molotov. Molotov was Stalin's strong right arm. I'm sure. Listen, she lived it. She should know it. I have never seen a human being more perfectly represented in the modest conception of a robot. You remember Monty Montgomery, the great general? I used this quote in the first class, but I do it again. Indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. I want to point this out again, and I know you'll think this is slightly redundant, but you could picture it, couldn't you? Richard the Lion-Hearted. You know, the man who gave us Robin Hood in a certain fashion. His life was one magnificent parade, which when ended, left only an empty plain. And you think about great people in history, men and women, who lived great lives and whose stories were dramatic. But when all was said and done, they are forgotten. And then Churchill's description of his great friend Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Meeting him was like opening your first bottle of champagne. Isn't that something? George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, on whom so many classics have been based. Few people practice what they preach, and no one less than Mr. Bernard Shaw. His dissolvent theories of life and society have been sturdily banished from the personal conduct and his home. It was a vivid description of a man who was one of the greatest thinkers and playwrights in British history. But what about our own George Washington? Interesting. Lord Cornwallis once observed, and Cornwallis, of course, the great British general who lost the colonies, if you will, once observed that in Yorktown, that the military fame of George Washington would rest not on the Chesapeake, but on the Delaware. It was that marvelous, bitter, nerve-wracking campaign that revealed the fortitude and consistency of that great American leader. I want to give you a little humor now. I mean, I can go on and on. I have so many hours of this, it's unbelievable. But let me try this because I want to be able to cover some other things. In a sense, it's misleading to recount many of the delicious anecdotes about Winston Churchill. They could serve to distract from the greatness of his accomplishment. Churchill is more than a lovable character. For few characters can slip into caricature, and that was the essence of his ability. So here are just a few examples of Churchill's wit. At a weekend party given by the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim Palace, where I would remind you Churchill was born, Churchill found himself seated next to Lady Astor. The beautiful American-born Nancy had been angered at some of Churchill's savage attacks on Baldwin government and had fought him in the House of Commons debates. When coffee was served, the acid-tongued Nancy said, "Winston, if I were your wife, I would put poison in your coffee." "Nancy," Churchill replied to the acid-tongued lady member of Parliament, "if I were your husband, I would drink it." I told you this story, but it's worth repeating because the imagery is so great. During Churchill's first visit to the White House in December of 1941, the British Prime Minister was surprised one morning by an unexpected visit by President Roosevelt to his bathroom. F.D.R. propelled himself in his wheelchair, found his guest stark naked and gleaming pink from his bath, faced with the visions of the American president, put his chair into reverse, but Churchill stopped him, saying, "Stop. Pray enter. His Majesty's Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Isn't that marvelous? But do you understand the spontaneity of it? That's what's so amazing. When Churchill returned to 10 Downing Street in 1951, which I described to you last week, he soon scheduled a trip to inspect NATO defenses, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization just founded. On his way to the plane, he met the head of Cyprus, Archbishop Makarios. Do you all remember Makarios? He survived for many, many years. He asked his defense minister and future prime minister, Harold Macmillan, what kind of man the archbishop was. And this was the response. It is one of those priestly aesthetics concerned only with spiritual grace, or one of those cradily crafty prelates concerned rather with temporal gain. Macmillan responded, regrettably, the archbishop seems to be one of the latter. Replied Churchill, rubbing his hands. He's one of our kind. Maybe we can work together. I want you to stop and think about making the best of a worst situation. And that's what Churchill did with Archbishop Makarios. After his escape from capture in the Boer War, Churchill made plans to stand for Parliament. To make himself look older, he grew a mustache. A friend of his mother's was not, however, enthusiastic. Winston, she scolded when she encountered him at a dinner party. I approve of neither your politics nor your mustache. Madam, Churchill replied, you are not likely to come in contact with either. Can you imagine having a dinner party with Winston Churchill present? When the first destroyers arrived in the fall of 1940 under American Lend-Lease programs to Great Britain, Prime Minister Churchill went out to inspect them. He was joined by F.D.R's right-hand man, our good friend Harry Hopkins. Churchill, looking at the decidedly overaged ships, grumbled in a whisper, cheap and nasty. Hopkins, who was startled by the remark, queried, what was that? Churchill amended aloud, cheap for us, nasty for the Germans. You know, again, it's a question of a turn of phrase. While sitting on the platform waiting to speak, the then 78-year-old Churchill was handed a note by an aide. Churchill glanced at the message, which advised, Prime Minister, your fly is unbuttoned. Churchill scrawled back, never fear, dead birds do not drop out of the nest. You understand, this is brilliant. This is remarkable. Would that we had people who could compose such thoughts today. In May of 1955, as he approached the end of his tenure as prime minister, a debate was conducted over the BBC entitled Christianity versus Atheism. How appropriate we're in a chapel where such a debate might never have taken place. Churchill objected to the programming. The BBC spokesperson responded, it is our duty to truth to allow both sides in this debate. Churchill shot back, I suppose that if there has been the same devices at the time of Christ, the BBC would have given equal time to Judas along with Jesus. How interesting. You all know the expression, to err is human, to sin divine. During the wartime coalition, the president of the Board of Trade was the austere cabinet and Calvinist member, Sir Stafford Cripps. Cripps both tithed and teetotaled. And as I pointed out earlier, he was even a vegetarian. His only concession to pleasure was smoking cigars. The habit, too, he swore off during the war. When he announced at a rally that he was now giving up cigars as an example of sacrifice, Winston Churchill responded. He was seated on the same platform. He leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "Too bad. It was his last contact with humanity." Can you imagine? I mean, I could give you many examples. One night in the House of Commons, Churchill, after imbibing a few drinks, stumbled to a rather corpulent Labour Party member from Liverpool, who straightened her clothes and addressed the British statesman. "Sir Winston," she roared, "you are drunk, and what's more, you are disgustingly drunk." Churchill, surveying this rather heavy-set woman, replied, "And might I say, you are ugly, and what's more disgustingly ugly. But tomorrow," Churchill said, "I shall be sober." One weekend, while Churchill was resting at Chequers, the official country home of the British Prime Minister, the minister found Churchill retouching with his brush the oils of Rubens' masterpiece on his easel. Like a naughty boy caught in the act, Churchill looked sheepishly. Then he muttered in defense, "Poor little mouse, if he were to gnaw the ropes and rescue the lion, he had to be made bigger." In other words, there had to be full strength. He was remarkable. Once Churchill was sitting in an outside platform, waiting to speak to a crowd who had packed the streets to hear him. Beside him, the chairlady of the proceedings leaned over and said, "Doesn't it thrill you, Mr. Churchill, to see all these people out there who came just to see you?" Churchill replied, "It is quite flattering. But whenever I feel that way, I always remember that I instead could be making of a political speech. Imagine if I was being hanged, the crowd would be twice as big." There are so many such anecdotes. At a formal banquet in London, the attending dignitaries were asked the question, "If you could not be who you were, who would you like to be?" Wouldn't that be a great question for a class? You all should think about that. If you could be anybody, who would you like to be? Naturally, everyone was curious as to what Churchill, who was seated next to his beloved Clemmy, would say. After all, Churchill couldn't be expected to say Julius Caesar or Napoleon. When it finally came to Churchill's turn, the old man, who was the dinner's last respondent to the question, rose and gave his answer. "If I could not be who I am, I would most like to be," and here he paused, took his wife's hand and said, "Lady Churchill's second husband." Isn't that something? You know, it was the spontaneity of his thought that made him so remarkable. George Bernard Shaw, who we discussed earlier, wired Churchill in 1951. I am reserving 2 tickets for you for the opening night of my new play. Come, bring a friend, if you have one. Churchill composed a return telegram. Impossible for me to attend first performance. Would like to attend second night, if there is one. I want you to understand that this is the chuckle. How many politicians have that kind of humor? And don't you think it humanizes a politician? On his 75th birthday, and I'm 74, so my 75th is in March. Hard for me to believe. I may use this as the cornerstone of my invitation to my party. On his 75th birthday, a reporter encountered Churchill as he left the London Hyde Park residence where he lived. Mr. Churchill, do you have any fear of death? I am ready to meet my maker, Churchill replied. And then he added with a twinkle, but whether my maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter. It's fascinating. Stop and think about how his mind must have worked. You have to really think about that. Sarah Churchill, Churchill's oldest daughter, married Vic Oliver, a music hall comedian. At a family dinner at Chartwell, Oliver brought along a guest who tried to draw out his famous father-in-law from one of his periodic silent moods. Winston, who, in your opinion, was the greatest statesman you've ever known? Benito Mussolini, was the unexpected reply. Benito Mussolini? What? Why is that? Asked the surprised Oliver. Mussolini is the only statesman, grumbled Churchill, who had the requisite courage to make his own son-in-law be executed. Can you imagine such a statement? As First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War, Churchill reportedly was asked by a temperance group to reconcile the Royal Navy's practice of christening ships by breaking a bottle of champagne across the bow. But, madam, replied Churchill, the hallowed custom of the Royal Navy is indeed a splendid example of temperance. The ship takes its first sip of wine and then proceeds on water ever after. Who could come up with such a thing? At a New York reception in Churchill's honor, cold fried chicken was served along with champagne. Churchill asked for bread, whereupon his hostess, a lady of Victorian sensibilities, gently chided him. We say instead the term white meat. The next day, a corsage arrived at the lady's house. Attached to it was a card. Winston Churchill, PM. On the other side, he had scrawled a note. I would be most obliged if you would pin this on your white meat. That's one way to keep abreast of the situation, wouldn't you say? I could recite for you barbs and blasts of mockery and parody. In short, I could go on and on. But I promised Lily she would have a moment to speak to you, which I want to give her. And I know many of you have questions. And I shall offer my final summary on Churchill after you take the requisite 10-minute break. 10 minutes, then your questions, and we'll go on. You can take about 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
Yeah.
7.
No, because there's so many questions. Who did not grow up in the United States. She grew up in the Soviet Union. I have found her to be extremely articulate, and not only that, very astute in her observations on history. She also feeds me wonderful desserts. And having now assured that I will receive yet another shipment, it's not lend-lease, it is consumed completely. I want her to offer a few brief comments, and she promised me to be brief. Go ahead.
Oh. Hello.
No, you have to do it here because you're being recorded.
Where?
Just talk into that little thing right
Over here?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. With your permission, I will introduce myself. My name is Lilia. I am a student of the Fromm since 2004. I don't think a lot of people around here started in 2004. I was born in former USSR, in Odessa, Ukraine, across from Turkey on the Black Sea. Given the fact that I came to America at age...
Let me hold it because then go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Given the fact that I came to America at age 54 with 0 English, you will excuse my accent, okay?
Okay.
Be patient. He spared for me 3 minutes. You check. I will start reading, and then after I finish, I will give some 30-second comments, okay?
Yeah.
This is an article. I found this article many years ago. And when I showed last Monday to the smartest man, professor, he said he never knew it. I was so proud of myself. By the way, Odessa, it's a very, very famous city. It's a melting pot like America. It was founded during Catherine II, Ekaterina II, by French and Italian people, Duke de Richelieu and de Ribas. And melting pot because it was a goal of Katrina to make the city a center of trading through the Europe. So people from Greece, from Italy, from France, you name it, came there, a lot of Jewish.
Okay.
As well. One sec. And that's why sense of humor in the city. If Churchill used to live in Odessa, it would not be for him as easy as in England to make jokes, believe me. Okay, now I'm reading. Saved by Winston Churchill, creator of the best brands. You call it brands, brandy, we call it brands of cognac, Armenian cognac. His name was Makar Shedrakian, Armenian. He was born in 1907 in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. Coming to Soviet Armenia after the Armenian genocide at the age of 28, in 1906, it was Armenian genocide. He created a blend of the first Soviet brandy. And by the age of 32, he became the best taster of brandy spirits at the USSR. In 1942, Sedrakian creates a unique 50-degree cognac Ararat. This is bottle. Sorry, no cognac inside. Next time. Which was first presented at the 1943 Tehran Conference. Cognac was presented to Churchill on his birthday by Stalin. After trying a drink, the British Prime Minister said he no longer touches other cognacs. Churchill also once advised, never be late for dinner, smoke Havana cigars, and drink Armenian brandy. Sedrakian, then time passed, war was over, and Sedrakians, it was very common during Stalin's and Lenin's era, was arrested and sent to Gulag. Have you heard Archipelago Gulag? Have you heard the name Archipelago Gulag written by Solzhenitsyn, who used, you know the story, okay. You're almost educated as our professor.
Wait.
I'm sorry, I'm kidding.
Good.
Okay. Now, he was arrested and sent to Archipelago Gulag for no reason, as it was common at Stalin's time. During his absence, Ararat was making by other people. Churchill complained to Stalin that the quality of the drink had deteriorated. Then Sedrakian was forced to return to Yerevan. That's why it said saved by Churchill, before he was killed and died in Gulag. And he was entrusted again with the cognac business. Mark Karyan Sedrakian was called the god of cognac art for creating much brands of cognac as Ararat. For it doesn't matter. Here's now, it's another knowledge about Churchill. I'm not sure our professor mentioned it. Here is Churchill's philosophy of socialism. Socialism is a philosophy of failure, a creed of ignorance, and gospel of envy. I decided to say it because I was raised there. You know what the worst thing? All of us were brainwashed. When Stalin died, we were crying. I was 14 years old because we didn't have information. Because, as Churchill said, Iron Curtain. That's it, I'm done.
Thank you, Livia, thank you.
Patient.
Oops. Now, I want you to know, I had hoped you would bring samples for all of you. But okay, let me now proceed to your questions, and I'm ready to take them. Some of you have had some very good ones, and I'll repeat them because this is being recorded for posterity. Yes. Yeah, the bottom line is she's suggesting what many people in Britain felt, which is that Churchill was out of touch with the welfare state, which Britain turned into under the Labour Party in 1945. The national health care, so many remarkable things. And you're absolutely right. Churchill was of a different age. So let me explain that in this class, I've tried to highlight the pros and cons of Winston Churchill. There are many things which Churchill did which were reactionary in every sense. He opposed Indian independence. He didn't care about the famine. He frankly made comments about Muslims which are deeply offensive. That was Churchill. So the lesson of the life of Winston Churchill is that nobody is perfect. Oops, I'm supposed to be standing here so you can see me, right? Nobody is perfect. But Churchill's genius was in marshaling the English language and putting it into battle and making you laugh, right? Making me laugh. He became human to the British people, and they rejected him in 1945. And he had been rejected previously in elections when he stood. But that was the beauty of Churchill. Yes. Yes. Question is about Churchill and Truman and how they got along. You must understand that while I described and Churchill described Roosevelt as like taking your first drink of champagne, Churchill viewed Truman very differently. But he understood Truman's essential goodness and his understanding of the world. And so he embraced Harry Truman, and Harry Truman embraced Churchill. You might equate it with a second wife, okay? I've never had a second wife, so I may be speaking completely out of turn. You can love your first wife, and when she's gone, you can still love your second wife. It's a different passion, it's a different sense, but it's filled with affection. And that is the way Churchill felt about Harry Truman. And I think it's a fair description. Yeah, they came from disparate worlds, but many American politicians come from disparate worlds. Think of Nixon and Kennedy. Kennedy came from great wealth, great power, and Nixon came from nothing. And yet they both contributed to the future of America. There was a question about Joe Kennedy. Who wanted to ask that question? Yes, go ahead. Yes, question is about Joseph Kennedy and appeasement. Joe Kennedy had supported Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. Roosevelt was very grateful to him. He was the first head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Somebody remarked it was sort of like putting a fox in charge of the chicken coop. But Roosevelt understood the strengths of Joe Kennedy. In 1936, Joe Kennedy wrote a small book, Why I'm for Roosevelt. It became a leading volume in his campaign effort for a re-election bid, which resulted in his carrying all but 2 states, Maine and Vermont. The slogan was, prior to that election, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. After that, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. But Kennedy wanted a reward. He was an Irishman through and through, and he wanted to become ambassador to the court of St. James. Now, let me explain that Franklin Roosevelt had a great sense of humor. And the idea of putting an Irish Catholic as ambassador to the court of St. James appealed to his wit and his wickedness. But I have to tell you, there was a problem. Joe Kennedy was bow-legged. So Roosevelt brought him into the office and he said to Joe Kennedy, take down your pants. Take down your pants. And Joe Kennedy was startled. And Roosevelt said, how can I send, remember you had to wear breeches when you presented yourself as the ambassador. There was a protocol to be followed. Roosevelt said, how can I nominate you? You're bow-legged. People will laugh. Roosevelt had a great laugh, and then he put Joe Kennedy in as ambassador to the court of St. James. When Joe Kennedy first went to Britain, he traveled with his family, which all of you can recall was a very remarkable, very photogenic, lovely family. And there was another advantage. Joe Kennedy got along very well with British aristocracy, including Lady Astor. But there was a problem in Joe Kennedy's makeup. He loved his children. And he knew that if there were a war, his oldest son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., and his second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and yes, even if the war were a long war, his third son, Robert Francis Kennedy, would all be part of the grind of war. And Joe Kennedy was horrified by the thought of putting his sons in jeopardy. Remember, that was what motivated Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain had lived through the First World War, had seen the grind, if you will, of war, and was determined to avoid it. And so Kennedy and Chamberlain had an affinity for each other. Both wanted to preserve the lives of their families, of their countries. And so Joe Kennedy became an appeaser. But he had a mean streak to him as well. He hated Jews. It was not remarkable for Irish Catholics in those days, who were raised by a church which still believed the Jews killed Jesus, to adopt that kind of horrific attitude. Now, the war breaks out. And we are not at war. Britain is at war, but we are not yet at war. And Franklin Roosevelt runs for a third term. And he needed Joe Kennedy. Now, I want you to understand that young Joseph Patrick Kennedy was a delegate to the 1940 Democratic Convention and did not vote for F.D.R. on the first ballot. He voted for James A. Farley, an Irish Catholic who was chairman of the Democratic National Committee and who was a close friend of his father's as well. But Roosevelt needed the Irish Catholic vote. He was running against Wendell Willkie, who was very popular. And so he summoned Joe Kennedy back from Britain. Joe Kennedy had been seduced by Henry Luce, the editor of Time magazine, the creator of Time and Life. And the deal was that Joe Kennedy would come back, step off the boat, and endorse Wendell Willkie for president of the United States. Roosevelt left an order. He wanted Kennedy to make no statement. He was to come immediately to the White House. And Joe Kennedy, essentially, the pot was sweetened. Why? Because young Joe Kennedy was planning to run for governor of Massachusetts in 1942. So essentially, in order to preserve Joe Kennedy's political options, Franklin Roosevelt was able to get Joe Kennedy to endorse him for president in a national radio broadcast, which Kennedy paid for. And originally, it was supposed to be an endorsement of Wendell Willkie. Joe Kennedy delivered the speech, and that was the end of his relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. Because remember, in politics, most people are self-serving, whether you were in British politics or American politics. The best book on this subject was the doctoral thesis written, then published, by Michael Beschloss, called Roosevelt and Kennedy. There's a lot that has come out since Beschloss wrote the book, but it still remains the basic primer for the relationship between these two men. Remember, Roosevelt had a problem. Most Americans opposed going to war until Pearl Harbor. The week before Pearl Harbor, a poll was taken, and half of the American people opposed going to war. And Roosevelt had a concern. There was a lot of pressure that he go to war. Some of you remember William Allen White, who was the editor of the Emporia Gazette, a small newspaper that nobody read, but they listened to William Allen White, and he became head of a committee to help the Allies. And one of the people who joined that committee was a young Adlai E. Stevenson. So there were a lot of interconnections, a lot of dynamic that took place. But Joe Kennedy was not, he was not a nice man, let me put it that way, unless you agreed with him. And, you know, when John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, there were a lot of people who were very apprehensive. And the only thing he did to separate himself from his father was to say, I am my own man. But remember, John Kennedy could not have had a political career if his older brother Joe had not died in the war, because he was going to become the man who became president. And it was John Kennedy who was resistant to being president, or running for political office rather, who was forced by his father to run, and who financed the campaign. Joe Kennedy, who financed his 1950 campaign for the United States Senate against 1952 against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Joe Kennedy, who helped his son in every way to win the Democratic nomination in 1960. If it hadn't been for Joe Kennedy's money, if it hadn't been for, excuse me, Joe Kennedy's money, John F. Kennedy would never have been nominated for president of the United States. I want you to understand clearly the role of Joe Kennedy, which does not excuse in any way his being an appeaser or being an anti-Semite. Next question. Yes. Yes. I want to recommend a book. It was a bestseller. It was called Roosevelt and Hopkins. The book is brilliant, by Robert Sherwood, who was an aide to Hopkins, and describes vividly that relationship. I want to remind you that Harry Hopkins was one of Roosevelt's closest advisors. He was called Harry the Hop. There were some who thought that if Roosevelt could have designated a successor in 1940, it would have been Harry Hopkins. The problem was that Harry Hopkins was very ill. It was stomach cancer, I think, really, but he kept going until 1946. But I'm fine. I've got water right here. Thank you very much. If Hopkins had been healthy, would Roosevelt have put aside his desire for a third term? Probably not. But Hopkins was the person who Roosevelt felt the greatest affinity, and Truman used Hopkins in relationship to Stalin throughout 1945 and into 1946. By the way, Harry Hopkins lived in the White House because Roosevelt wanted him to be accessible at every moment. Next question. Thank God. Oh, yeah. Wait, who didn't ask? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, you. Question is, when a former president, and let's relate it to Churchill, when a former president or a former vice president or a former prime minister makes a comment on world affairs, should you be surprised? When did Churchill deliver his speech on the Iron Curtain? He was a former prime minister, and he spoke out based on his convictions. Former presidents have that same luxury. There is an unwritten tradition which really began, I would say, in the post-World War II era, after Truman stepped back from politics, that former presidents remain silent on their successors and what their successors are doing. Barack Obama has decided that he wants to re-enter into the debate over national affairs. It's his right. I don't agree with Barack Obama's assessment, to be honest with you. But can you imagine, and I want to use as an example, George W. Bush. Do you think that George W. Bush, sitting in Crawford, Texas, does not have ideas that he would like to express? I mean, if he could unload, I can imagine what he'd say about Donald Trump, for instance. But have you noticed a deafening silence out of Crawford, Texas? Now, here's a question which is most interesting. Churchill retires in 1955 as prime minister. The Suez Crisis took place in 1956, and the man who was his hand-picked successor, Anthony Eden, who had been foreign minister, and who had been a foreign secretary rather, and who had been his closest associate, failed miserably. What did Churchill do? Nothing. He did not condemn Anthony Eden. So let me tell you the problem. I once had a job in which I established the whole program. I hired the staff. I ran the program from top to bottom. And let me tell you, I was very tough, but the program was a great national success. And then I decided to come back to San Francisco. And I never said another word about the program or the way it was run. Because any of you who've retired from business understand that once you begin criticizing your successor is screwed. So I commend Barack Obama for his opinion, but a former president has no more vote than you do or I do. In fact, most former presidents simply fade away. But they have opinions. And Churchill, to his credit, and remember, Churchill was compos mentis, I mean, really aware until 1960. I would say after 1960, he's not quite as much there. If you saw the movie, or I think it was in The Queen, where after he'd retired, been out of office for a few years, Queen Elizabeth asks Churchill to come in to consult about some major problem. And in the middle of their conversation, as the Queen is explaining her concerns, Churchill is asleep. He falls asleep. So, limitations. So my answer about Obama is, I'm glad he's still vigorous. I'm glad he still expresses his opinion, but I can think of many former presidents who expressed opinions with whom I disagree profoundly. Yes. He expressed his view that there should be an immediate ceasefire. He bent over backwards on that. And of course, the Israeli position is there cannot be a ceasefire until they are destroyed. And I want to remind you, and let's go back to Churchill for a minute. In the movie last week, which I hope most of you saw, or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, you will note that some of the leaders of Britain, including the former Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, including the former Foreign Secretary, including key people in the Conservative Party, came to Churchill and said, you have to negotiate. You have to find a way out. And the scene in the film is sort of silly, but it's illustrative. Because for a moment, he was shaken. And in the movie, they show him getting on the underground and talking to just common Britishers. Well, you know, that's absolutely silly. That's not the way he conducted policy. But It strengthened his resolve. I want to remind you, it depends where you sit. If you are someone who says a ceasefire will help bring peace, you should support a ceasefire. Maybe that would have been the right thing for Britain to do in 1940. If the war had gone differently, that might have been the thing to do. But what is Churchill exalted for? He's exalted for saying, no, I will not give in. Now, let me remind you, who did Benjamin Netanyahu nominate to be Time Magazine's Person of the Century? It was Winston Churchill. And I can tell you with some certainty, because as you know, I keep up on this rather well and know the people involved, that when Benjamin Netanyahu considers what happened in Gaza and the prospect of having to negotiate with Hamas, who won't negotiate with the Israelis, by the way, because they don't believe Israel has a right to exist, he says, we're going ahead, and we don't care what the world thinks. Now, you can make an argument, and if I were teaching my course on the Middle East, I would stand on one side and make one argument, and the other side and make the other argument. I can do both with equal effectiveness. But who in the end wins the argument? The prime minister, or the president, or the person who makes the decision. And let me assure you, you can disagree with the decision being made, but you're not the person in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt put it. You're not the one who has to make the decision, and you have to live with the consequences of what your decision is. That's not a defense of Netanyahu, nor is it a defense of Winston Churchill. If Britain had lost the war, how would history view Churchill? Think about it. And I say this because that is the definition of leadership, right or wrong. You understand? This is not a course on the Middle East, but there have been a number of you who've taken my course on the Middle East. And that's the reason why in that class I present both sides with equal clarity and equal passion. But in the end, who makes the decision? You know, I remember something vividly. There was no greater critic of Anwar Sadat than those in Israel and the Jewish community. Sadat was a brutal dictator. Frankly, he made comments about Jews that were very unpleasant. He called for the destruction of Israel on numerous occasions. And who was his adversary? Menachem Begin. Not exactly the most moderate or temperate person you'd ever want to meet. But what happened was a marriage of convenience. They needed each other. And that's how a treaty with Egypt evolved. And I will never forget, in an interview that I think he did it with Barbara Walters, Sadat was very clear. He said, to arrive at this conclusion, we have to put history aside. May I tell you, Yasser Arafat made very much the same comment over the question of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. Now, I'm not advocating one way or the other. Some might call it appeasement. Some might say it's a stiff-necked position. Some might say if you want to succeed in politics, you have to compromise. Or you can be what Winston Churchill was. Even when he was wrong, he was determined to proceed. And whether it was social welfare, and he was not a socialist, he once said that you can be a socialist when you're young, but when you get older, you know better. I know it's not funny to you, but do you understand? For people who disagree with your position, it's the ultimate in witticism. I get that, frankly, from Trump supporters. I didn't spend all that time on the radio being neutral or dispassionate. But the reason the Trump people used to call me is because I allowed for that kind of discussion and dissent. But in the end, you have to make a decision. May I tell you, it's like a teacher in a classroom. When you come into a classroom, you have to decide what it is you're going to present. And you have to make sure you present it in an effective fashion, because if you don't, everyone will go to sleep, or they won't come back to your class. You may not agree with everything a professor says, and let me tell you, I did not major in subjects as much as I majored in professors. I sought in my college years the best professors, the best presenters, the most stimulating thought. And I will tell you a quick story. My professor in history was a man named Harry Nerhood, who had a double doctorate in history and in testing. So I come in for my first test in a history class, where I can assure you I knew every single answer. Arrogant as a freshman, but well-deserved because I really was very smart. So I get the test, and it says put column A, column B, column C. I did everything. I put column A and column A, column B and column B, column C and column C, and I failed the test. And I went to Dr. Nerhood's office, filled with all of the arrogance that I could demonstrate. And I said, Dr. Nerhood, I knew the answers to all the questions. I knew them all. And he said, yes, John, but you didn't read the directions. You were supposed to put the answers to column A, the answers to A in column B, the answers to column B and column C. I hadn't read the directions. And he looked at me and he said, I'll bet you never fail a test in my class again. And he was right. So not everyone in history gets everything right. Let me give you another example, if I can. And it comes from the life of Winston Churchill. Churchill believed in imperialism. When he drew the lines on the map in the Middle East, he thought he was being absolutely brilliant. Remember Lawrence of Arabia? Well, Lawrence represented a family, the Hashemite family, on the Arabian Peninsula. They were the ones who created the Arab Revolt. And when the war was over and the map of the Middle East was drawn, the Hashemites owed the British, and the British owed the Hashemites. And they had no kingdom. So Churchill drew a line on a map, and he separated Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, and created something called Transjordan, which became the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And he put one of the Hashemite princes, Abdullah, on the throne. But wait, he wasn't finished. He created another country, a country called Iraq, because there was another Hashemite prince who had to have a throne. And so he created a kingdom called Iraq, and he put Faisal on the throne. Now, let me tell you, if you had lived in 1920, 21, 22, 23, and we had been teaching this class, we would have said it was a stroke of genius. He took an ally, he created a kingdom, he created an ally, he created a vehicle to ensure British dominance in the region. It made perfect sense. There was only one problem. It made no sense at all. So you can take the most logical conclusion, and that brings me back to the question of Chamberlain versus Churchill. Or can I put it in American terms? Charles Lindbergh versus Franklin Roosevelt. And the question becomes, what is the right path to take? And I have to tell you, as someone who has been engaged in politics, has worked in politics my whole life, who has done foreign policy consulting, who is considered to be an expert on the American presidency, even when I'm certain I'm not sure, because you never know exactly what the implications of your actions are. So what was Churchill's great strength? His certainty, his arrogance, his unwillingness to bend. Now today, when we think of 1940, we celebrate Winston Churchill as the man who saved Western democracy. We celebrate his stubbornness. We celebrate his brilliance in analysis. But did he deserve that acclaim? In the end, he was asked how history would be written in terms of evaluating his own role. And he said, I can only tell you, I'll turn out okay because I will write the history. And that brings me to former presidents. What is the habit now of former presidents? They write memoirs. They write memoirs, not just for history, but to justify themselves. Wait, you want to read the most partisan history of World War II you'll ever read? The 5-volume work of Winston Churchill. By the way, and I want to again thank Jane Blattis, you can buy this for me, along with everything else. Inscribed copies are very rare for a mere $875,000. Yes. Yeah. Okay, let me answer this question, again relating it to Churchill, if I may. Question is, what about Joe Biden's reelectability? 80 years old, clearly not as vigorous as he was. So imagine that this is 1953, and you live in Britain, and Winston Churchill is already the aging lion. He'd already had some real health problems. He's had several heart attacks. Do you entrust Britain to the hands of an old man? Do you? Well, the decision was to go along with it. Do you remember this 1960s? 1950s, rather? You had Churchill. You had Adenauer. You had Eisenhower. You had Chiang Kai-shek. I'm just giving you examples of people who are already in their 60s or 70s, who already had major health problems. Would you vote for him? The betting by the Democrats in 1956 was that Eisenhower, who had suffered a heart attack in September of 1950, a massive heart attack, that if Eisenhower were reelected, Nixon would become president. When Stevenson delivered his last great speech to the American people before the election, he talked about the fact that Eisenhower would probably not survive, that Nixon would become president, and it would be Nixon land filled with deceit and dishonesty and corruption. Guess what? Eisenhower didn't die until 1969. Churchill survived his term in office. Konrad Adenauer retired when he was good and ready and lived on for a number of years after, in his 90s. Charles de Gaulle never would have retired, but he was forced to by political circumstance. So here's the question when you ask about Joe Biden. I would love to teach a course on alternative points of history, how history could have been different. I have a whole collection in my library of books dealing with that. Some of those essays, by the way, were written by Winston Churchill. What if the South had won the Civil War? But it is just that. It's alternative history. You don't know what the outcome will be. One of the people I had on my program wrote a book that nobody's ever read. But it's a very good book. It's called What If Bobby Kennedy Had Lived? It's a pure speculation, but I'll give you a better example. Those of you who listen to my podcast know I occasionally will cite a book. 3 Newsweek writers wrote a book make note of this, if Israel had lost the war, if Israel lost the war, was written in 1969 by 3 Newsweek writers who offered the premise, offered by Golda Meir, what if the Arabs had struck the Israeli airfields first, the Israeli Air Force was decimated, and the Arabs had conquered Israel? Now, let me tell you, it's alternative history. It's counterfactual. And it's a pure speculation. But I read that book, and I reread it every year to remind myself of what could have happened. But let me remind you that history is not made on what could haves. History is made on what happened. And that's why this course on Churchill is so important. Churchill's great strength was his determination. And sometimes one can say that he went in the wrong direction. And yet, if I were to ask you who the greatest politician, statesman in the world in the 20th century was, it would be Winston Churchill. Churchill is credited with saving civilization. Oh, he had help. He had Franklin Roosevelt. He had Wendell Willkie. He had Harry Truman. There were a lot of people who worked with him. But who was the voice? You know, I used this as an expression at the very first class, and I read you this quote, which I share with you again if I can find it. First, he was history's child. But secondly, he became the voice that saved the British people. He was stubborn, but he was right. But, you know, it's interesting. He could have been wrong. One could write a counterfactual history about Churchill that would prove that. But counterfactual doesn't matter, ladies and gentlemen. What matters is what really happens. And that, I think, is the essence of Winston Churchill. Remember what he said at the very beginning? We are all worms, but I'm a glowworm. He believed that he was a person of destiny, that he could not be killed by a bullet in battle, that he could not be killed by an automobile that hit him in New York, that he could not be killed when a plane crashed and he could walk away from it. He believed in his own destiny. And, you know, right or wrong, that's history. Let me conclude because I see time is up. Wait. Then you get the last question. And I'll repeat it. Go ahead. Yes. A large comment, go ahead. He's saying she grew up with a great deal of respect for the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Yes. No, and we're being recorded, which is why I want to do it. Yeah, she's saying the shibboleth of communism or socialism still is something that we attack. And you're absolutely right. And yeah. I understand. It's hard because you don't have a microphone and we're recording this. Let me just be clear. There is in this country today a feeling of being against socialism and against communism. I remember when I was in high school and we debated the question of whether we should have socialized medicine in America, the pros and cons. And I remember vividly, it was before Medicare. Medicare is socialism. Social Security is socialism. But it was socialism, it was a positive socialism. And that is the difference. But you understand, and you remember the Red Scare. You remember when the Republican Party riled against socialism. And I will tell you just quickly, when Nixon went to China, conservative Republicans opposed the trip to China because it was a sellout to Red China. And I had long discussions with Nixon about this. And I understood what his motivation was. He wrote an article in Foreign Policy in the fall of 1967. The title of the article is Asia After Vietnam. Look it up. Nixon was viewed as a traitor. And if you remember, in 1970, he was opposed in the Republican primary from the left by Pete McCloskey and from the right by John Ashbrook of Ohio. Now, I can tell you that both McCloskey and Ashbrook made brilliant cases. And in fact, you might have said they were right. But neither one was president of the United States. The same thing can be said of Winston Churchill. He may have been wrong, but he was the prime minister. You may say the same thing about Donald Trump, but he was the president of the United States. And the same thing applies to Joe Biden, whether you dislike or like someone. And I'll offer the observation that we may not agree with people in power, but we better listen to them because they're the ones who determine, in large part, our policy. Now, I want to conclude my last words to you by saying, I owe you an apology. I've tried in this class to present the life of Winston Churchill in 7 lectures. It's impossible. And I regret everything I have left out. But please be aware that you took this class because you understood what Winston Churchill represented to the world. And so I wanted only to thank you and to tell you I've done my best and I appreciate all of you. And don't worry about your grades. I'll work that out. Thank you very much. Oh, wait, Lilia wants to make...
Attention.
Yes,
My last question to Professor. Please forget that you are professor. Just, I want your question as a regular human being. How would be reaction Churchill today regarding situation with Israel?
It's a great question. What would Churchill say today? Well, I could guess, but it would just be a speculation. Thank you all very much.